And we are live. Good afternoon, Maverick Insiders, and thank you for joining us today in a discussion about Eskom, arguably the biggest threat to South Africa's economy. Eskom's debt, as you know, stood at about 488 billion at the end of March 2020, up by almost 50 billion compared to a year previously. And by all accounts, that number is closer to 500 billion now. Eskom releases its results at the end of the month, and we will all be a little bit more informed at that point. While our power utility is looking at cutting costs, I think 14 billion is this year's number, cost cutting alone is not going to make up for the precipitous fall in revenue as demand falls. And that demand is falling because the economy is contracting and because those that can are jumping off the grid as fast as Jack Lightning. This, as you can imagine, has dire implications for both Eskom and the municipalities that sell power at a healthy premium to the Eskom rate. Eskom CEO, Andre de Ruyter, has been in the job for 9 months now. He's already lasted longer than many previous incumbents. And he's making changes. But is he making changes fast enough to prevent the utility from falling into this death spiral that we hear about? To discuss this complex subject in a very short hour, I have two highly knowledgeable people with me. Eskom spokesperson, Sikonathi Mantshantsha, who by virtue of his position knows Eskom from the inside, but his former role as an investigative journalist means he knows Eskom from the outside. And I have Doug Kuni, an engineer and industry veteran who worked for Eskom between 1983 and 2005. He was chief engineer. He's responsible for building many of the power plants that we have on the Highveld, and he took the decision to leave Eskom at the time that they were talking about building Medupi and Kusile. After his departure from Eskom, he was an independent or is an independent consultant in the sector. He was head of the Independent Power Producers Association. So you can say that he knows his way around this sector. So welcome, gentlemen. I look forward to this discussion.
Thank you very much, Sasha, and good afternoon to all the people who are participating in the webinar. Good afternoon also, Sikonathi.
Thank you, colleagues. Good afternoon, Maverick Insiders.
So, Sikonathi, let's start with you. Let's lay the groundwork. And can you give us, perhaps in short point form, the 5 key achievements that Andre de Ruyter and his team have managed to accomplish since January this year?
Thanks for the question, Sasha. I must say it must be feeling quite strange for a lot of the Maverick Insiders with me on this side now from the last time we interacted. So briefly, the first thing to note is that many people in this country, including us in the media, have for at least the past 15 years been bleating about all the wrongs at Eskom and for all the wrong reasons they had been in the headlines. And in all that 15 years, it was all about destroying a great institution that I'm sure Doug will agree was a lot better an institution to be prouder of than it is at this point. So it took the better part of 15 years to get us to where we are, where we almost have to talk about load shedding on a daily basis. And as such, therefore, 9 months is perhaps quite a hasty period to claim any significant gains. However, I will list a few for you. The Ingula Power Station, which was commissioned in 2016, deep in the Drakensberg, it had serious design defects that limited its output to only 240 megawatts per unit. It has got 4 units in total, whereas it was designed for full output of 333 megawatts. In March this year, all the repairs were completed to enable the power station to perform at full capacity. You can imagine your super fast vehicle that can drive at 300 kilometers per hour, not that you would want to try that on land, being limited to only 60 kilometers per hour. So the Ingula in March has now been repaired. It's giving us the full 1,200 megawatts that it was designed for. That's point number one. The second point, Eskom has initiated exactly that kind of work for the Medupi power station, which since the commissioning of the first unit in 2015 has only ever produced a maximum 60% capacity, 60% of capacity at each of the 6 800 megawatts generation units. Unit 3 was completed and it is now giving us a full 800 megawatts. Unit 6 and Unit 1 have also been completed. I'm talking about the design defects that hobbled the performance there. Right now, at Medupi, Eskom is busy completing these repairs to the design defects to Unit 4. The remaining 2 units, being Unit 2 and Unit 5, will be completed by the end of this year. So you will then, for the first time, have full capacity coming from the power station, which will go a long way to increasing the capacity, the electricity available. That's your third point. The fourth point of success is the payment for municipal for electricity provision. Let's start with the municipalities. You have seen Eskom accelerating collection mechanisms and efforts. Starting, the most prominent of the events was with the Mfuleni municipality here in Gauteng, where Eskom attached a movable property in order to collect debt of more than 2.3 billion rand owed by the municipality. We have since then moved on to the Maluti Apufum and to Mwate municipality, and the latest is Machabeng in Velkom in the Free State, where Eskom has now managed to secure or to hold farms worth 2.5 billion rand as security. These are unprecedented moves on the part of any leadership team at Eskom, and this current team has enjoyed the support of the government to do this. This has resulted in the payment levels by municipality increasing by about 5% per month since this. And in Soweto, lastly, Sasha, in Soweto, where again Eskom is owed a lot of money, the payment levels by the residents there for electricity doubled to about 25% in March from about 12% last year. And I'm saying in March, before the COVID pandemic hit and the lockdown dropped all economic activity. So those are the major 4 successes. The last part, Eskom has now successfully divided the generation, the operation units to generation division, to transmission, and to distribution with the respective boards of directors of these companies, which is the first step towards separating the company into 2 separate, three different entities. So that is the outcome. Of course, the viewers at home might wonder what effect has that had. We will get to that point just now.
Indeed, it sounds like an awful lot of work in a short time. Doug, can you give us, in sort of equally short form, the 5 things that you believe Eskom should feasibly have achieved in this space of time? Do you think that they've achieved a lot, or should they have focused on other objectives? But I'm interested in your perspective as an outsider.
Thank you, Sasha. I think from a economy perspective, if we look at certainly some of the most urgent things that we need to attend to is economic growth. And economic growth is not possible as long as we have load shedding. And if you remember correctly, the first time load shedding occurred was 2007. It was Thursday, the 18th of January, when the first load shedding started. And the following year, in 2008, Eskom had to shut down the mining industry for 2 weeks because of the lack of power on the system and the demand it could not meet. So if you take it in total, we've had load shedding for almost 13 years now. That is an extremely long period. And it reflects in the economic performance. So the most urgent issue from my perspective is Eskom has to get to grips with the base load stability. Now, before COVID, in 2019, the demand figures were already low because of economic depression. But when COVID came along, they were depressed even further. However, even during COVID, we went into load shedding. So from an outside perspective, I do not get this feeling that we have our finger on the pulse as far as load shedding is concerned. So if I were in the position of the chief executive of Eskom at the moment, I would say that addressing the load shedding issue is the most urgent issue. And if we look at how you address load shedding issues, load shedding is a reliability issue. And when we had the highest reliabilities, we had very good technical competence at power stations. Technical competence at power stations was whittled away in the last decade. And I think reinstalling technical competence at the power stations should have been a priority. The other issue is management at power stations. During the years when we ran power stations at their best availability, the person in charge of the power station stayed at the Eskom township or whichever township was closest to the power station. These days, I'm informed that the managers at those power stations, the top managers, do not reside very closely to the power station. And that is not a good thing for a power station. To increase the reliability and the awareness of the personnel at power station, the person in charge of the power station must be within very easy reach of what's happening in the power station. So management at the power station is a critical issue. The other issue is reliability is a function of many things, but it is also a function of the fuel. So the quality of fuel going into power stations is a critical issue. If the quality is dispersed too widely, the units become unreliable. So the fuel, when we had tied mines, the fuel delivered to the power station had certain specifications. And throughout the life of that power station, the fuel supply was reasonably stable. But the fuel cycle has been disrupted by many different deliveries of coal from many different places, and this has caused a problem with reliability at the power station. So the fuel cycle really needs to be looked at. And then I would say executive headcount is really an issue within the Eskom management. When we had 65,000 people at Eskom, I'm talking about the early 80s, we had the top 200, which were the executive band. I'm told that these days we have an executive band that is in the order of between 450 and 500, which really is a top-heavy structure in management in order to streamline and make sure that the operations, because the operations just at generation is 80 to 85% of Eskom's investment. And therefore, the 90% problem that Eskom has at the moment is just in one group. It's not in the wires business, it's in the power generation business. And that's to do with costs, that's to do with cost overruns, that's to do with schedule, that's to do with competence. All those issues come into play. So I think 9 months is a very short period for a chief executive to achieve a lot, because there's so much inertia in the organization, and that has to be overcome in order for plans and to be implemented. So I think from my perspective, I would say the effort to attend to the load shedding issue should be the uppermost priority from my perspective.
So let's stay with load shedding at the moment. I mean, with the economy contracting by anywhere between 8% and 10% in the next year, one could argue that keeping the lights on is a national priority as we try and rebuild. Yet Eskom, I mean, we had load shedding during lockdown, despite the fact that we lost 7,000. Well, demand fell by 7,000 megawatts. And I'm sure this isn't something that Eskom is ignoring. So perhaps, Sikonathi, do you want to respond to Doug? Do you want to tell us and the audience a little bit about how Eskom is getting on top of this issue? I mean, we heard it was going to be 18 months of load shedding. Now we're told it's 3 years of load shedding. Just now, it's going to be another 13 years of load shedding, as Doug's alluded to in terms of our history. What is happening inside Eskom? What can't we see?
Doug is absolutely spot on in terms of the lack of reliability of the generation infrastructure. There can be no argument about that. Here's what is happening, and he is absolutely correct again in the problems with regards to the fuel that goes into these stations, and a lot. He obviously is a proper insider in the generation business itself, so he knows what goes into running a power station, a coal-fired power station. Here's what has happened. For the first time, about 3 weeks ago, Eskom suspended 2 power station managers in order to investigate the poor performance of their power stations. I'm sure in any respect, in any self-respecting organization, a 44% availability of any product is a disaster. And amongst those at Eskom that have now been suspended, their power stations have been performing at around that margin. There is no way that can be acceptable in a normal institution. So Eskom has taken these efforts and suspended the managers in order to investigate whether there is any cause for disciplinary action against them, and indeed what is to be done to correct the situation. That is an attempt to address exactly the point that Doug has made about reliability and availability of the energy factor. That's just the starting point. The reliability maintenance that Eskom has been talking about, yes, it is true that we will have load shedding for at least at these current levels of occurrence, or at this rate of occurrence, for about a year. Thereafter, around this time next year, it should be significantly reduced. I'm being careful here to use the word reduced. It will definitely not be eliminated. The only way to eliminate load shedding is to make sure that in addition to properly maintaining your existing plant, is to bring additional capacity, because the moment you bring in any certainty in terms of reliability of the current fleet, investors come in as they should, which then consumes more electricity. In that regard, then Eskom has requested from the government, which makes the policy and makes the decisions about investment into new power stations. In December 2019, it requested an additional 5,000 megawatts, and specifically stated this should come from outside of Eskom, because I'm sure now the most optimistic of my colleagues are aware that Eskom cannot build any new power stations until, one, the debt problem has been resolved, and two, our own internal capability has been improved, just like Doug has said. So we are in that process, and Eskom is pleased, therefore, to note that the government has initiated a process to procure the emergency 2,000 megawatts, and there is another 11,800 megawatts to be produced or to be invested in over the next 8 years. That is the starting point. On its own, fixing the current power stations that Eskom has, we've got power stations that are still in operation way beyond their design, their operational life. Fixing those on its own is not going to deliver the outcome of total reliability. We need additional capacity. And on the part of Eskom, what can be done internally at this point are the repairs that I spoke about earlier, and making sure that once you've repaired a power station, you don't come back tomorrow and talk about a boiler cube leak or something to that effect.
One of our insiders, Barry Howell, I mean, you've touched on it, and he's asking where Eskom is going to procure this 5,000 megawatts from. And we are in the process of procuring additional power, but it's very slow. Doug, independent power producers, other private power producers, what perhaps just elaborate on what the situation is and where can we expect to see power from? I mean, what about the Turkish power boat scenario that one of our viewers is also talking about? It seemed to be a slightly dodgy thing, but they were promising vast amounts of power on tap. What is the situation, Doug?
Yeah, I think there will be lots of contributions from people as to how they think they could address this problem. But I think it's important to point out that the load shedding problem is a base load instability problem. The renewable energy projects and other IPP projects coming in will not address the base load problem. They will add to capacity. We will produce more green power in certain periods, but the baseload instability is the culprit as far as load shedding is concerned. When you lose an 800 megawatts to 800 megawatts, a 600 megawatt unit, a 500 megawatt unit, the IPPs simply don't have such capacity to put into the system. So it is absolutely important that the baseload instability problem is solved. Now, there will be capacity that's required in the future to take up. In this decade, we will be retiring some plant. As Sikonathi says, some plant have already reached the end of life, of service life. And they should be also very uneconomical at this stage. However, I find it a bit perplexing that we refer to reliability problems as simply a maintenance backlog. It does not work like that. You cannot ill-treat and do no maintenance in your plant for 10 or 12 years and then do one maintenance backlog and think your plant will be reliable again. That is not the way it works. Reliability is a function of many things. It's a function of design, it's a function of procurement, it's a function of construction, it's a function of commissioning and testing, and it's a function of operating and maintenance and the fuel cycle. So all those issues result in reliable plant. If you observe what's happening at Medupi and Kusile, I mean, you have a compounded problem between design, construction, commissioning and testing, and the poor operators. I mean, I really sympathize with them simply because an operator is like a bus driver. He will press all the buttons and change all the gears, but if there's something wrong with the engine, he cannot fix the engine. The engine should have been fixed in the testing and commissioning, in the construction and in the design phase. So the point I'm making is that it's simplistic for me to understand that if you catch up with the black backlog in 12 months, the reliability problem is going to go away. I cannot see that happening. My perspective is you need a much more involved technical competence to attend to the reliability issues. It's not just, and by the way, I mean, Eskom has used the term reliability maintenance. All maintenance is reliability maintenance. Maintenance is necessary, but it is not sufficient. You need to attend to many other areas, as I've mentioned, to address the reliability issue, including the fuel supply. So I do not have confidence in the 12 months unless the right resources are brought to bear on the problem.
Okay, so part of the problem, I'm told, is breaking Eskom into smaller, more manageable units. And Sikonathi, you referred to this right in the beginning of our conversation, that Eskom has already done the preliminary work in creating a generation unit and a as Doug refers to it, are wires, the transmission and distribution units. But the deadline for these actually becoming operational, I mean, I understand that within Eskom they're ring-fenced, but legal separation, I think, has been postponed to 2021. What is happening there, Sikonathi, and how key is breaking Eskom apart to it becoming more manageable for us dealing with baseload issues and the fundamental problems that Doug is talking about? Siko?
Sasha, the breakup into 3 units is not necessarily on its own going to address the severe performance problems. That is a governance mechanism in order to isolate the issues. The real deal with addressing maintenance still lies with the generation and the new build teams right now. To separate these companies into 3 will address governance issues and may be able to help isolate the problem areas where, for example, you will see where there is non-performance by people, and you may then be able to isolate procurement and ensure that you've got the correct processes and you buy the correct parts. So it's just to really divide the same loaf of bread and putting it in different places, so the rotten one does not infect the others, if I may use that term. You are using the word postponed. The separation has not been postponed. It's very much in progress. However, for it to be done properly and for there to be no excessive mistakes, you need the time. Eskom generates about 170 billion rand annual revenue, and with about 46,000 employees, it is one of the biggest companies, if not the biggest, in this country. It took Old Mutual at least 3 years, a company much smaller in terms of people and operations, certainly in terms of boots on the ground, much smaller than Eskom. It took Old Mutual 3 years to achieve full separation, and that is the time frames that we are working with, all the way to around December 2023, not 2021. That is when you will have the units turning into legal entities. At this point already, the people have been relinked to the various units in which their work belongs, and you will have, when we report the financial results, you will have a clear sight of where the revenues are, where the debt is, and stuff like that. So for all intents and purposes, the separation has occurred.
So while I completely agree with you, this model is not going to get to the heart of the problem, which is actually creating and building new generation capacity. The idea is to make Eskom a more nimble operator. And Doug, I'm interested to hear your opinion on this. I mean, is the breakup of Eskom into 3 different divisions, with Eskom Transmission still playing the role, or a key role, buying as the chief buyer of power? Is this a model that we're seeing around the world? Is it a model that works? Is it a sustainable model?
Thank you, Sasha. Yes, it is a model that is observed in different parts of the world, and it works. It works quite well. What it does is it does allow independent power producers to participate in the power production more competitively, and that's a good model. I would applaud Sikonathi on his being candid that in our circumstance, our 90% problem within the Eskom group is just in one group. It's generation, power generation. Separating the wires business is a governance thing, but if the transmission system operator comes into operation, then you would have a wider participation and of IPPs into the system, and also it will encourage competition in the generation area, which is always a good thing. So I think NERSA requirements normally were that the separate divisions of Eskom, which was generation, transmission, and distribution, always submit separate accounts. But I think now internally, as Sikonathi says, they have separated sort of the management structures into 3 separate groups. But I will also agree with him, it doesn't address the generation issues, because that's the 90% problem. That is the problem that is the most urgent problem we need to deal with in South Africa at the moment, because that is the enabler for economic growth. And if there's economic growth, then the added capacity is required and the investments will be made. But if economic growth is suppressed,
yes.
yeah. Sorry, carry on.
No. Doug, I have to tell you that Clive Dale, who's sitting at home and watching this webinar, says, please come back to Eskom, your country needs you. But before we get on to the subject of new capacity, let's deal with the elephant in the room. And Khaleb Kachalia, I think, is asking the question that everybody is asking, and what about the debt issue? We have 500 billion rands worth of debt, and it's a subject that we're not really talking about because Eskom's not going to government with a begging bowl. But that doesn't mean the problem's gone away. It's simply receded into the back of our consciousness as we deal with COVID and many other issues. But what is happening, Sikonathi? What are the discussions inside? What are the discussions with Treasury? Where do we stand? Please tell us.
Sasha, as the people of South Africa are aware, they have, through indeed the Treasury, generously and, well, of course, forced by circumstances to extend bailouts to Eskom over the past 5 years, including the latest where Tito Mboweni bailed out Eskom to the tune of 23 billion rand per year over the next 3 years. Eskom has committed that it will not go back to the taxpayer again with another begging bowl. We have from within Eskom to do everything that we can to be self-reliant. That's of course easier said than done. We are working with a target of reducing that debt, which will still increase a bit before coming down to reducing it to about 200 billion rand outstanding debt. And you mentioned earlier that capex has been reduced by about 14 billion rand this year. So those savings there will be directed to paying down the debt, which is still not nearly enough. Hence the efforts I spoke about earlier, where you tap on the municipalities to pay up on the 31 billion rand of debt outstanding at the end of July. You to tap in the communities in Soweto to play their part. Everybody who needs to use electricity needs to pay up. We internally, you are aware that in March, Eskom tried to address the problem that Doug was talking about of too many chiefs at the top, where it offered voluntary severance packages. About 200 managers, it was only limited to managerial ranks. 200 managers did accept these and left Eskom. Again, the payoff there will be within 12 months, those savings. So within Eskom itself, we are doing everything to redirect more funds. One, to keep the plant going and do all the maintenance that can be done and the design and repair to the design defects there, but also to allocate more money towards paying down the debt. Of course, the biggest component, as I have said earlier, has come involuntarily from the taxpayer. So those are the talks. At this point, Eskom does not have any plan of going back to the taxpayer and ask for more money.
Doug, it's unfair to put you on the spot, and it's unfair perhaps to ask this question of you. But given the debt spiral that we're seeing at utilities around the world, given the fact that more and more people are moving off the grid wherever they can, do you believe that the current model is sustainable? I mean, Eskom is doing what it can. It's cutting, it has cut capex, which is probably a terrifying thought, actually. But cutting the bloated management layer is something that we all applaud. Is it enough?
Thank you, Sasha. I think so much is tied up with economic growth. It just seems to underpin everything we have. The most important issue to address is setting Eskom on a sustainable path. If the load shedding issue was addressed, and if there was growth in the economy, Eskom would be selling more electricity. Their revenues would go up. The reliability of the units and the deferred maintenance must all be attended to. And these require expenditure. So we would have an unsustainable model if we continued with load shedding and still had the same financial requirements. It's like we built Medupi and Kusile at almost twice the cost, and we're getting half the availability of these power stations. That should have been reliable units on the grid, pumping electricity into the base load, and we wouldn't have had load shedding. So much is underpinning it. However, the financial model is totally unsustainable if we remain on this path. If we are at 500 billion direct debt at the moment, and we include, that's the Eskom balance sheet. But if you include the treasury, the state balance sheet, there is still all the guarantees on the PPAs for the IPPs, which in international finance reporting standards are PPAs which have been assigned to the Eskom balance sheet. They are debt obligations. So if we go into more procurement with the single buyer model, the contingent liability of the state balance sheet together with the Eskom balance sheet is going to be seen as one debt by the rating agencies. So the financial model is not sustainable unless we fix up the things that underpin a growing economy. Eskom will not be able to service its debts if it cannot make the revenues, which is the current situation. Eskom cannot service debt, and that's why it's getting the bailouts from the taxpayers.
So where does the answer lie? I mean, it's a conundrum that we're all grappling with, and it's not an easy answer. But you know, the debt is the debt. We have to deal with the debt, and I mean, I wish I could say abracadabra and the economy grows, but what?
Yeah, there are really two aspects to the problem. The one aspect is that we're not technically getting to grips with the issues of load shedding. If we got to grips with the issues of load shedding, and we were then in a position to instill the confidence of investors, then you would be selling more electricity, the revenues would go up, the investors would invest, etc. But now you have a problem of the technical competence and a financial problem. And the financial problem is predicated on one thing, that going forward with all the financial support, etc., you won't have another Medupi, and you won't have another Kusile, and you won't have cost overruns, and you won't have unreliability, and we'll be producing all this electricity which will be consumed in the economy. That's what it's predicated on. So there are really two elephants in the room. The one is a technical one, and the other one is a financial one. Sorry, Sikonathi.
Sasha, if you allow me
Siko, do you want to jump in?
Yes, on that particular point of getting on top of the load shedding problem and the technical issues, Eskom has prioritized bringing skills back into Eskom. The starting point is now the project manager of the Kusile power station, Avin Maharaj, who has been brought back from South Korea to come. He previously worked at the Kusile power station. He is now in charge of that project, and we are getting slowly improved performance coming out of there. And Eskom continues to fill these critical vacancies at the executives and indeed the technical people at these levels which seeks to address exactly the point that Doug makes. However, Doug also does know and admitted earlier that within this, unfortunately, cannot be resolved in a short space of time. I have spoken about the plans that will bring reliability and indeed performance from Medupi and from Kusile, and the maintenance. He correctly again makes a point that it's not simply a matter of maintenance. I'm aware of one of the companies in South Africa which skipped maintenance on a plant 1 year. It took 8 years to catch up and bring that particular piece of equipment to reliable production again. So we are in for the for quite a rough ride. But definitely the skills shortages, the critical things that make generating electricity possible and more reliable. Eskom is on top of those. You will not immediately see the outcome, particularly as you see the energy availability factor at just under 70% at this point. Ideally, it should be at 85%, and we are working towards achieving those in a matter of a few years.
Sikonathi, Rajen Padiachi is asking, let's just bring our viewers in here for a second, because he's asking, will power from the independent power producers be integrated into the grid anytime soon? I mean, we're talking about a financial issue, we're talking about a maintenance issue, but we're also talking about an availability issue. And so let's talk about availability and new capacity for now. So what about independent power producers, and are we utilizing what we have at the moment before we get into bid round 5? Are we utilizing what we have to the best of our ability?
Rajin and another person, in fact, earlier asked, how will Eskom procure this additional 5,000 megawatts? Let's clear that up. Eskom made it clear in December 2019 in a request to the government. If you remember that emergency that caused Cyril Ramaphosa to make a U-turn from Egypt and fly back to South Africa when Eskom had load shedding at stage 6 in a hot summer's day. On that occasion, Eskom requested specifically that the government must license independent operators to build at least 5,000 megawatts of capacity that would then be sold into the grid. And the government agreed with Eskom that this was an emergency and it should be procured, this capacity, immediately. So yes, the policy decisions lie with the government on that respect, on new capacity. Eskom implements existing government policy, which at this point allows Eskom to operate the machines that it currently has. We await the government, and as we have stated earlier, only last month did it issue a request for proposal. It said there's an emergency, 2,000 megawatts to be gotten from the private sector. We requested that emergency support in December. By comparison, Sasha, a country in Europe, Poland, in December, from start to finish, request for proposals to actually licensing new operators. That's Poland. In December, it took 3 weeks. There are builders now. In South Africa, we are 10 months later, still do not have any new capacity. So it's not Eskom that will bring in this capacity.
Yeah.
We are waiting for the government to license, and the government, of course, is going through its processes to license the private operators.
I think I love your word, it's processes. I think there was a comment on Twitter the other day from Anton Eberhardt, who you gentlemen and most of our audience will know well as an energy expert. And I think he was bemoaning the fact that our Minister Mantashe has failed to gazette the Section 34 determination to procure more both emergency power and the planned power since NERSA gave its approval. And I think it's 20 months now since those your Eskom stage 6 power cuts, and sometimes it's unfathomable. And Doug, perhaps you can comment on the process that we go through here as to why this is taking so long? I mean, Eskom is also just a player, and regulation has to make its way through the system, doesn't it?
Yep, absolutely. Sasha, the status at the moment is the model that's being used is Eskom is the single buyer. That's the model in the system at the moment. So a procurement program is run by the Department of Minerals and Energy, and the IPPs who are all accepted preferred bidders then close their projects, and all those IPPs sell into the grid at the moment. So the model is still that when there's a ministerial determination for extra power, it will run through a procurement process, and that power will then be fed into the grid. The question that we have to answer is, what are the fuel options to bring emergency power or to bring in mid-merit power? Because if it's not coal, then we're looking at imported fuels. Whether it's gas, whether it's diesel, whether it's LPG, whether it's naphtha, there's all sorts of imported fuels that will have to be accounted for in order to bring in this emergency power. So it's a different model to the existing model, and so there's a cost issue. There is a cost issue, and that will have an impact on tariff.
A different fuel other than, what about renewables? I mean, renewables, the renewable contingent will tell us that renewables can be baseload power. There's a lot of talk about batteries and storage capacity, and we're now procuring storage capacity as well in one of the determinations. So why do we have to talk about importing diesel or importing gas, although gas from Mozambique seems to be something that we can look at in the future? But Doug, what about renewables? Are they not the answer?
Well, the renewables are feeding into the system at the moment, but in our current structure of the power supply system, if one looks at the load curve and the demand curve, etc., renewables play a very limited role within the baseload area. I mean, within the mid-merit area. Renewables cannot produce 24/7 electricity. So some projects will produce for about 16 hours a day, but most of them do not. And they are intermittent. And we do not have sufficient storage in our grid system to be able to store energy. So the issue really is, if we had a reliable baseload and supply, we would be able to integrate the renewable energy projects much more effectively. At the moment, unless these renewable energy projects come with battery storage, which is an expensive story. If you look at utility scale batteries to be installed, then the cost of electricity becomes very expensive. At some stage in the future, it may be possible if the cost of batteries come down, but unless you have a stable supply in our current system, it's not so easy to integrate all the renewables. There is an issue of intermittency of the renewables that is not an easy thing to deal with on the grid.
So we come back around and around, and it comes back to the baseload issue, which seems to be an issue that is very much within Eskom's hands, and the answer seems to lie in getting Medupi and Kusile back up and running. Will that solve the problem? And I think there's also, I mean, Marge Hemp is asking the question, what are we doing about, I think, Hitachi and many of the contractors who actually let this country down? I mean, it was a team of people who let this country down, but these international contractors failed abysmally to deliver. What is happening there, Siko?
Sasha, the first point, will Medupi and Kusile solve the problem? The answer is no. Here's the reason. We've got power stations like Camden whose service has already been extended beyond their 50-year design life, and within the next 5 years they should be decommissioned. This is about 8,000 megawatts of capacity that will be taken off, which for all intents and purposes is ineffective at this point. Doug did make this point quite early on, that they are inefficient and too costly to run, and they produce very little. So Medupi and Kusile will only be replacing what we have now in the way of capacity. But a growing economy needs additional capacity, which we will not have. Definitely we will have some reliability, but it is additional capacity that we need. For the past 12 years, Eskom's output or the demand for electricity has actually been reducing by about 1% every year. We are still producing less than we did in 2006. So whatever you are doing now is replacing capacity that we had back then in 2006, when the economy was still growing at about 5% per annum. What we do need is indeed new capacity coming on stream to help power a growing economy. All the maintenance and all the repairs to Medupi and Kusile will only be to stabilize the situation as it is now. Hence, the request for additional capacity, and I must also say that we are not here only because these power stations have just fallen over themselves, but also we have to admit as Eskom that we have not always done things the way we should have. We have generated other things more than we should have. The core business of Eskom is to generate electricity, but we seemed to be busy with many other nasty things over the past 15 to 10 years. Doug, as an insider, will know more about those.
So, Doug, tell us then, if we get our ducks in a row now, when is the earliest that we can anticipate new power coming onto the system, and from where?
Well, I think there are procurement programs being run at the moment, and there are dates which have been hallmarked for that capacity to come in on an emergency basis. So I think in the next couple of years, there will be more capacity coming on stream.
The next couple of years?
From renewables and mid-merit stations. However, you know, I must say, and I am not of the view that bringing in individuals who worked at Eskom is going to address the deeper problems of reliability. You need skilled engineering teams who understand the process from design all the way to commissioning, testing, and operating and maintenance, who can address these problems in a very thorough way. I mean, I know Eskom is making an effort to bring in skills again, but individuals will not do the trick. We are talking about skilled engineering teams with skills across a spectrum of applications and competencies to really fix up the deeper problems of reliability. Now, if Medupi and Kusile can be brought to a level of reliability of 70% plus, it will make a huge difference. It will make a huge difference to the grid operations. And once we have stable baseload, we can then say goodbye to the load shedding issues. And if the load shedding issues are attended to, then, and you know, Sikonathi has said it a few times, a growing economy. The operative word there is a growing economy. In a load shedding environment, there will not be a growing economy, unfortunately.
I have an interesting question here. It's a rather controversial one from William Smook. And he's actually asking Doug and Sikonathi, I think, for your opinion on this subject. Minister Mantashe said earlier this week that nuclear power will play a major role in South Africa. But given the cost, given the lead-in times of nukes, does it make sense to either of you? Sikonathi, do you want to dive in first? And Doug, we've got literally 5 minutes left, so keep it tight.
Sasha, from an Eskom perspective, we are an implementing agency of the government of the Republic of South Africa, which through the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy makes this policy, determines who is going to build what and what technology we are going to use. Therefore, if the minister indeed makes it policy that we will have a new nuclear power station, he will also by law make a provision for the funding thereof and who actually is going to build that. At this point, Eskom has specifically stated, and it is clear for anyone to see, that Eskom does not have the balance sheet to carry out any significant investments.
Diplomatically put. Doug?
A simple answer is I agree with Sikonathi. I don't think it has the balance sheet to pursue nuclear. However, nuclear, as an option, is a very expensive option compared to other forms of electricity production. So we're looking at a long lead time, probably not relevant to this decade. We need to solve problems within this decade to decide on exotic options like nuclear, from my perspective. Yep.
If I may come in, Sasha, I think Doug is being too relaxed and too generous here. We do not have the luxury of solving problems in this decade. We need to be solving problems that have afflicted us for the past 13 years. It should not be in a normal situation, in an ambitious for an ambitious people and country to be talking about the same problem of load shedding for 13 years. If we do not do things, if we do not change the way we do things and start seeing the agency for what it really is, we will be having this problem for another 13 years. Let's repeat this again. A country, Poland, which does not have an electricity crisis, managed to do the procurement from end to start to finish in 3 weeks in December 2019. In 10 months in South Africa, we are still talking about potentials.
So I think you are reminding us that at the end of the day, Eskom has problems that it can solve, and then there are problems that are actually outside of the preserve of, or outside of the control of Eskom. I mean, and that's the point you're making, Sikonathi, am I correct?
Definitely the point I am making, Sasha, is that Eskom is mandated by the government to build when the Department of Mineral Resources says go ahead and build. If Eskom had all the monies in the world and did not need any financial assistance from the government, it would still require a license and permission from the government through the energy ministry to build power stations. As an implementing agency, we are limited to what we can do by what the law allows in this country.
Right. Doug, in 30 seconds, are we going to be here in another decade talking to Sikonathi? Is Eskom going to be here providing us with power? Can it survive?
In a nutshell, Sasha, we have very urgent things to attend to, and all hands should be on deck to attend to those urgent things. In this decade, we are burdened with further challenges. That is the retirement of existing plant. That means new capital requirements are going to be staggering, but it can all be done in a growing economy. So I would say the urgent and the most urgent thing to address at the moment is we need to address the load shedding issue. Once we get our fingers on that pulse, all the other steps that we need to take will be very well enabled, and we'll be able to integrate all the IPPs and all the other power producers into the system much more easily.
Right, Doug. Sikonathi, from Doug's mouth to your ears to the bosses at Eskom. But I really want to thank both of you for an interesting hour. I want to thank our audience for listening and participating, and Future Growth Asset Management, who is the sponsor of this webinar. Good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the participants.
Sasha, I don't know if I will be here in a decade. You have had some spokespeople and 14 chief executives. Thank you.
Okay. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Sikonathi, thank you.